Ancient engineers built portable weapons that could tear straight through armor. A hidden blade turned a bare hand into a lethal trap. And a Roman machine launched grappling hooks clean across the sea. There's more where that came from. These are ancient weapons so far ahead of their time, they shouldn't have existed. Bagnak, tiger claws. In 1659, a Hindu king named Shivaji was leading a rebellion to carve out an independent kingdom in western India. A fight that would eventually grow into the powerful Maratha Empire. A rival general named Afzal Khan wanted to crush that rebellion before it could spread, so he set up a meeting inside a tent, supposedly to negotiate peace. Both men agreed to come unarmed. Neither of them meant it. Shivaji had quietly worn a shirt of chainmail under his clothes and hidden a dagger up his sleeve. Afzal Khan, for his part, carried a curved dagger of his own. When the two men stepped forward to embrace, in the traditional greeting reserved for allies, Khan tried to drive his blade into Shivaji's back. It struck the hidden mail and failed to break the skin. Shivaji had a weapon of his own tucked inside his right fist, the Bagnak, or tiger claws. It was a simple design. A metal bar sat flat across the palm, held in place by two rings slipped over the first and last fingers. Because the bar rested inside the hand, a closed fist looked completely empty. Anyone patting Shivaji down before the meeting would have found nothing. With one fast strike to the stomach, Shivaji tore the general open and ended the fight before it properly began. His bodyguard, Jiva Mahala, then held off Khan's own guard while Shivaji slipped out of the tent and signaled his hidden troops to ambush the rest of the Bijapur army waiting outside. The clash became known as the Battle of Pratapgarh, and it turned Shivaji from a regional rebel into the founder of an empire. While Shivaji fought with the Bagnak at close range, roughly 17 centuries earlier, a Roman commander was building a weapon that had hit an enemy without ever getting close at all. Roman Harpax. During a massive sea war in 36 BCE, the Roman commander Marcus Agrippa ran into a problem. Rome's usual strategy at sea was to drop a heavy wooden bridge onto an enemy ship and let soldiers cross over and fight hand to hand, the same way they fought on land. That device worked, but it was clunky. The bridges were massive, hard to store, and made ships slower and harder to steer. Agrippa needed a way to grab enemy ships from a safe distance instead of getting close enough to drop a plank on them, so he built a catapult-fired grappling hook called the Harpax. It was, essentially, a 7-foot wooden beam wrapped in thick iron bands. One end carried a heavy iron hook. The other end was tied to a long rope that ran back to a winch on the Roman deck. Instead of a sailor throwing the hook by hand, the whole Harpax was loaded straight into a catapult and fired across the water like a missile. When the iron hook slammed into an enemy hull, it buried itself deep in the wood. Enemy sailors would rush over with axes to cut the rope before the Romans could reel them in. But Agrippa had already accounted for that. The front section of the beam was wrapped in solid iron, so the axe blades just bounced off. Once the hook was set, Roman crews cranked their winches, dragging the enemy ship in close enough for soldiers to storm aboard. The weapon saw its biggest test at the Battle of Nolocus, part of the campaign against Sextus Pompey for control of Rome's western Mediterranean fleet. Agrippa's Harpax-equipped ships helped capture more than 180 enemy vessels that day, a result that effectively ended Sextus Pompey's naval power for good. That single battle mattered far more than a naval skirmish usually would, since it removed the last serious threat to Octavian's control of the Mediterranean and helped clear the path toward Octavian eventually ruling as Rome's first emperor. But centuries later, another naval power took that same idea of standoff weapons and turned it into something far more terrifying. A fire that didn't behave like fire at all.
Matos! Get down!
Greek fire. For close to 500 years, the Byzantine Empire held onto a weapon so effective that its enemies genuinely believed it was supernatural. They called it sea fire, or liquid fire at the time. Historians now call it Greek fire. It was first used in battle in 672 AD, when a massive Arab fleet closed in on Constantinople during a prolonged siege. Byzantine ships, fitted with bronze tubes on their bows, blasted a burning liquid straight at the enemy hulls, working almost exactly like a modern flamethrower centuries before anyone had refined fuel or pressurized engineering as we know it. Survivors described it producing a loud roar and thick smoke, like the breath of a dragon. The weapon is credited to Callinicos of Heliopolis, an engineer who fled Syria for Constantinople as the Byzantine Empire was losing territory to advancing Islamic forces. Worried about an attack on the capital, he experimented with different mixtures until he landed on something that worked, then sent the formula to the emperor. What made Greek fire so frightening was that it clung to wood and sails like tar, and it kept burning even when soldiers tried to douse it with water, apparently getting hotter instead of going out. That single detail turned it from a strong weapon into a psychological one. An enemy crew watching water fail to stop a fire had no obvious way to save their ship. One Byzantine emperor put it in writing that there were exactly 3 things the empire must never hand over to outsiders: the royal crown, the royal princesses, and Greek fire. That secrecy worked almost too well that when the empire finally fell, the exact recipe went with it. There was no obvious way to fight against Greek fire, but the next weapon on this list was terrifying just because it could turn on the person using it just as easily as the enemy. Indian Urumi. Most ancient swords work on a simple idea: keep the blade straight and rigid, aim, then swing or thrust. Shields exist because that kind of attack is predictable enough to block. Southern India came up with a weapon that broke that logic entirely: the Urumi. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a long leather belt. However, when you unbuckle it, you find a handle attached to thin, flexible steel blades stretching up to 6 feet long. The metal is treated to stay extremely flexible while keeping a razor edge on both sides, essentially turning it into a metal whip. You can't block with an Urumi the way you would with a normal sword, and you can't really strike with it in a straight line either. Instead, a fighter swings it in wide circles around the body, so nobody can predict exactly where the blade is going to land next. The Urumi wasn't really built for a formal battle line either. It doesn't pair well with formation fighting, since a fighter needs open space in every direction to swing it safely. Its strength showed up in close, chaotic combat, or in situations where a single defender needed to hold off several attackers at once without a shield wall or allies to lean on, which is part of why it survived longest as a personal defense weapon rather than standard military issue. Its unpredictability comes at a cost, though. If a fighter slows a swing too fast or gets the angle even slightly wrong, the blade can whip back and cut them instead of the enemy. Controlling it takes years of dedicated practice, which is why fighters historically trained with cloth strips standing in for the blade long before they ever picked up real steel. In Kerala and Tamil Nadu, where the Urumi comes from, it's tied to the martial art of Cheiroballistra, one of the oldest documented fighting systems in the world. Inside that system, the Urumi is taught dead last, only handed to students after they've already mastered staff work, short swords, and unarmed combat. It's treated less like a weapon and more like a final exam. The Urumi rewarded years of patient training, but this other weapon was built for soldiers who needed to fire fast without years of practice behind them. Chinese zhuge nu. Standard crossbows were powerful, but painfully slow. Fire a bolt, stop, pull the heavy string back by hand, load a new one, aim again. In a real battle, that gap between shots could get you killed. Chinese engineers solved the problem with a repeating crossbow called the zhuge nu, which fired bolts in rapid succession using nothing but a simple hand lever. Mounted on top of the weapon was a wooden box magazine holding up to 10 short arrows. A soldier pulled the rear handle back, which drew the bowstring into position while a new arrow dropped out of the box automatically. Pushing the lever forward, released the string and fired the bolt. Repeat that motion, and a trained soldier could empty all 10 arrows in about 15 seconds without ever stopping to reload by hand. Unfortunately, the mechanism that made rapid fire possible also meant the bow could only be drawn with a fraction of the force a standard crossbow used, so the bolts hit with a fraction of the power too. They weren't going to punch through thick metal armor. Chinese armies solved that shortfall the way they solved most range weapon problems. They coated the iron arrow tips in poison, so even a shallow puncture wound could turn fatal. One recipe recorded centuries later in the Qing Dynasty Encyclopedia, the Gujin Tushuji Cheng went by the name tiger-killing poison, said to be strong enough to kill a horse if it drew even a little blood. The same source describes the weapon as a favorite of elderly scholars and women working inside the imperial palace, valued less as a battlefield weapon and more as a compact, easy-to-use tool for self-defense. The zhuge nu worked because it was small, portable, and easy for one soldier to operate. The next weapon on this list worked because it wasn't portable at all. It was a fixed defensive machine built into a city's walls, and it turned an entire harbor into a trap. Claw of Archimedes. In 214 BCE, a Roman fleet sailed toward the Greek city of Syracuse, expecting an easy victory. Rome had the numbers and the ships. What they didn't expect was that the city's defense had been redesigned by Archimedes, widely regarded as the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world. One of his creations became known as the Claw of Archimedes, or the Iron Hand. The device was a massive crane mounted on the seaward wall, fitted with a heavy iron grappling hook on the end of a long rope. Roman historians who wrote about it later, including Plutarch and Polybius, describe Syracusan defenders swinging the crane out over approaching ships, dropping the hook onto a hull, then using a system of counterweights and pulleys inside the city to haul on the other end. The force was enough to lift the front of an attacking warship almost completely out of the water. Crews described their ships hanging in midair before the defenders let go of the ropes, dropping the ship back down hard enough to capsize it or smash it against the rocks below the wall. Roman soldiers reportedly grew so afraid of anything poking out from the top of the wall that they'd panic and retreat the moment they spotted a rope or a piece of wood moving above them, convinced Archimedes was about to unleash another engine on them. Plutarch wrote that the Romans began to think they were fighting against gods rather than men, since the attacks seemed to come from nowhere, and nothing they did in response worked. Roman commander Marcus Claudius Marcellus eventually gave up trying to take the city by direct assault and switched to a long siege instead, starving Syracuse out rather than risk more losses at the wall. However, no physical remains of the claw have ever been found, and the ancient descriptions are vague enough that historians still argue over the exact mechanics. That hasn't stopped people from trying to prove it could work. In 2005, Engineers working with the Discovery Channel series Superweapons of the Ancient World built a working model based on Archimedes' known principles of leverage and successfully used it to topple a full-scale model of a Roman ship. That result confirms the physics behind the claw were sound, using tools and materials Archimedes would actually have had access to in the 3rd century BCE. And that wasn't shocking, because centuries earlier, Greek engineers had already figured out how to use a soldier's own body weight as a mechanical advantage, just on a much smaller scale. Greek gastraphetes. Around 400 BCE, Greek engineers designed a handheld bow that didn't rely on arm strength to draw the string. They called it the gastraphetes, which roughly translates to belly bow or belly releaser. Normal bows were limited by how strong a soldier's upper body was. This design let a soldier use their entire body weight to load the weapon instead, which meant even someone without much upper body strength could fire it with serious power. The back end of the weapon had a smooth, curved wooden pad shaped to sit against the stomach. To load it, a soldier rested the tip on the ground, leaned their whole body forward over the stock, and pushed their stomach hard into that pad. That downward weight pushed a sliding track backward, dragging the heavy bowstring along with it until it clicked into a trigger mechanism. A built-in ratchet held the string in place while it was being loaded, so the tension didn't snap back the moment the soldier eased off. Because the bow limbs were so much thicker and stiffer than anything used on a normal bow, the gastraphetes could fire heavy wooden bolts with far more force than a standard bow of the same size. That extra power meant it could punch straight through armor and wooden shields from a distance most conventional archers simply couldn't match. In a fight, that gave a gastraphetes user an edge because they could start doing damage before an enemy archer using a regular bow was even in effective range. The gastraphetes proved that mechanical tension could outperform raw muscle. Roman engineers eventually took that same principle and shrank an entire siege engine down small enough to move across a battlefield on foot. Cheiroballistra. During the late Roman era, engineers took the massive, bulky catapults used in sieges and shrank them into a portable metal shooting machine called the Cheiroballistra. Older catapults relied on huge wooden frames, which had two major problems. Wood warped in damp weather, throwing off the machine's accuracy, and the frames themselves took up a lot of space and manpower just to move around. Romans fixed both issues by building the core frame out of solid bronze and iron instead of wood. The power still came from the same basic source as other Roman torsion weapons. Two hollow metal cylinders mounted on the sides, each packed with tightly twisted bundles of animal sinew and rope, held under enormous tension. Because the metal frame was so much stronger than a wooden one, it could hold more tension in a smaller footprint, packing more stored energy into a design that took up far less space. The curved shape of the frame also let the throwing arms swing back further before release, which meant more of that stored energy transferred directly into the shot instead of getting lost in the mechanism. The biggest practical advantage, though, was mobility. Instead of needing a whole squad of men to haul a giant wooden catapult into position, the Cheiroballistra was light enough to move quickly across a battlefield. While the Cheiroballistra shows how far metalworking could take a mechanical weapon, on the other side of the world without any access to iron at all, Aztec warriors built something just as deadly out of wood and volcanic glass. The Aztec Macuahuitl. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Central America in the early 1500s, they were already familiar with the usual weapons of native warfare: bows, spears, clubs, and shields. The Macuahuitl caught them completely off guard. At first look, it resembles a large wooden paddle or an oversized cricket bat, somewhere between 1.5 and 3 feet long, carved from dense hardwood like oak. It doesn't look like it belongs anywhere near a conversation about deadly weapons. The danger was in the edges. Aztec craftsmen cut grooves along both sides of the wooden body and set in rows of obsidian blades. Volcanic glass snapped down to an edge and glued them in place with natural tree resin. Each individual piece of obsidian ran roughly 1.5 inches long, and lined up together they turned the wooden paddle into a continuous cutting edge on both sides. Obsidian fractures at a molecular level when it's worked correctly, which produces an edge that is, under a microscope, actually smoother and sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Spanish soldiers wrote home with accounts that sound exaggerated until you understand the material. But the weapon wasn't purely for killing. Aztec warfare often prioritized capturing enemies alive for ritual purposes. So many warriors used the Macuahuitl to wound and disable rather than kill outright, favoring strikes that could bring an opponent down without finishing them off. Unfortunately, obsidian's biggest weakness was the same property that made it so sharp: it's brittle. A Macuahuitl could absorb only a handful of hard impacts, especially against Spanish steel armor, before the blades chipped or popped out of their resin beds entirely, leaving a warrior holding what was suddenly just a plain wooden club. That vulnerability became especially clear during the long siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, where prolonged combat wore obsidian weapons down faster than warriors could replace them, while Spanish steel kept its edge through hours of fighting. Celtic smiths in Europe knew this, and that's why they wrestled to build a blade long enough to matter in battle without it snapping the first time it hit something hard. Celtic La Tène sword. Before around 400 BCE, most swords in ancient Europe were short and rigid, built mainly for thrusting rather than swinging. And it wasn't really a design choice, it was a limitation. If you made an iron sword too long back then, it would bend or snap the first time it hit a shield or another blade with any force. Celtic smiths working in Europe found a way around that problem with a new blade design known as the La Tène sword. Their solution used a technique similar to early pattern welding. Smiths took strips of high-carbon steel and softer iron, bundled them together, heated the whole bundle, and hammered it into a single blade. The hard steel gave the finished sword a genuinely sharp edge, while the softer iron running through the core absorbed the shock of a heavy swing instead of letting the blade crack. That combination let Celtic smiths build long, double-edged swords over 30 inches long, weapons that could flex under pressure during a hard strike, and then snap straight back into shape instead of breaking. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. When Roman soldiers first encountered Celtic warriors in combat, they were caught off guard by how long and how tough these swords were. A Celtic fighter could swing a La Tène blade from horseback or on foot and land blows heavy enough to cut straight through wooden shields and leather armor, something a short Roman gladius wasn't built to match in a straight exchange of heavy blows. That single design innovation ended up setting the standard for how European swords were built for hundreds of years afterward, well beyond the era of the Celts who first developed it. Roman liberator mine. In 52 BCE, Julius Caesar had a massive enemy force trapped at the hill fortress of Alesia, but his own army was completely surrounded in turn, squeezed between the defenders inside the fortress and a relief force approaching from outside. To keep the enemy from simply rushing his lines and overwhelming his position, Caesar had his engineers build a series of hidden underground traps that functioned almost exactly like modern landmines. One of the simplest and most effective was a trap called the stimulus. Roman soldiers dug shallow trenches and buried heavy wooden logs inside them. Sticking out of each log were curved iron spikes shaped like giant fish hooks. Once the logs were in place, the soldiers covered everything back over with dirt, leaves, and grass until the ground looked completely undisturbed. When enemy troops charged across that field, expecting open ground, the hidden iron hooks drove straight into their feet, tearing through boots and locking them in place. A soldier caught in a stimulus couldn't easily pull free, which meant an advancing charge would suddenly stall out, with wounded men stuck in the middle of it, exposed to Roman missile fire from the walls. The stimulus rarely worked alone. Right alongside those hook traps, Roman engineers dug hidden pits lined with sharpened wooden stakes and set spring-loaded metal traps designed to snap shut on a leg the moment weight landed on them. Between all three trap types layered together, an enemy simply couldn't charge the Roman lines without a real chance of stepping on something designed specifically to maim rather than kill outright, since a wounded, trapped soldier caused more disruption to a charge than a dead one. By the time any surviving attackers reached the actual fortifications, hand-to-hand fighting had already been softened by a battlefield full of hidden injuries. Hidden traps, like the stimulus, let a comparatively thin line of Roman soldiers cover ground that would otherwise have needed far more manpower to defend directly, freeing up troops to deal with the relief force pressing in from outside. That kind of layered defense is a big part of why Alesia is remembered as one of the most decisive sieges in Roman history, rather than a defeat for Caesar's badly outnumbered army. Just like the stimulus influenced the creation of mines, the influence of this next weapon reaches all the way into modern rocketry, as it sends fire directly into the sky. Mysorian rockets. In the late 1700s, the Kingdom of Mysore in southern India changed warfare with a weapon nobody else in the world had figured out how to build properly: the first successful iron-cased military rocket. Rockets already existed elsewhere. China and parts of Europe had experimented with gunpowder-propelled rockets for centuries before this. The problem was always the casing. Paper and bamboo tubes, the standard materials at the time, burst open easily once the gunpowder inside caught fire, which limited both how far a rocket could fly and how much propellant it could safely hold. Mysore's ruler, Hyder Ali, and later his son Tipu Sultan, solved that by hammering soft iron into solid, seamless metal tubes instead. Iron could hold burning gunpowder under far more pressure without rupturing, which meant these rockets could fly over a mile, with some accounts placing their effective range as high as 2 kilometers, roughly double what contemporary European rockets could manage. Long bamboo poles strapped to the side kept the rockets flying straight rather than tumbling. Tipu Sultan took the weapon seriously enough to write an entire military manual, the Fathul Mujahideen, that formalized how rocket troops should be organized, assigning around 200 rocket men to each infantry brigade, called a kushun, with Mysore fielding somewhere between 16 and 24 of those brigades at full strength. Mysore maintained a dedicated rocket corps that, at its peak, numbered close to 5,000 specialized artillerymen, and whole squads would line up rows of these iron rockets on wheeled carts, launching coordinated barrages designed to overwhelm entire formations rather than pick off single targets. The tactic worked. Mysorean rocket brigades handed the British East India Company some of its worst defeats in India, most notably at the Battle of Pollilur, where sustained rocket volleys tore through British ranks and helped produce one of the company's most humiliating losses on the subcontinent. When Tipu Sultan's fortress at Srirangapatna finally fell in 1799, British forces recovered roughly 600 launchers and thousands of rockets, many of which were shipped back to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich for study. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on the screen for more fascinating stories.